Hi and welcome to week 3 of Research and Information Skills. This week what we're looking at and what we're attempting to answer is how and why do I record information. The topics we're going to be covering are things like types of academic literature, academic integrity, bibliographies versus reference lists, etc. And using bibliographic record sheets. I should say of the latter, that really this is just a form of practice to get you into a process of recording basically all the sources where you get information from. I should say, if you want to actually follow the PowerPoint, it probably would be helpful, although you don't have to. I'm hoping that I can speak out some of these topics without necessarily the aid of a PowerPoint slide. However, given that it's already in that format, it may well be of value to access that, just to give life to what I consider to be fairly two-dimensional things, which they are by nature, slides. That said, personally I prefer to hear narratives. When I was studying history, for instance, I found it quite compelling to listen to the historians who were giving us recorded lectures, and not so much about necessarily the content, which I suppose is slightly naughty on my part, but more about their excursions into the material that we were attempting to understand, and often it was the examples that they gave which were far more interesting than the content, though of course the content was far more important to getting assignments done, etc. Anyway, back to the point. If you have a look on slide 3, I've put down, there's a title I should say, of academic reading and the literature. I'll talk a little bit more about the latter shortly. Academic writing requires students to use material from appropriate sources to support their arguments. Now, as a key point of definition and a key point of understanding for you guys is that rather than just arguing from your own opinion about subjects in an academic setting like university, college, even high school, you have to review and take note of a range of arguments and opinions and judgments relating to a particular subject. So, for instance, if you have an essay question relating to, cats as domestic animals, you would have to look at a whole range of viewpoints, perhaps a vet's judgment, perhaps a naturalist's judgment, the effects on the environment, if there are any, and I think there would be if you consider feral cats. But you might also consider more obscure things like psychologists' view of people who keep cats. Are they happier? And research would suggest that they often are. People live longer if they've got to look after animals, for instance. So there may be a range of views that you have to take into account depending on the angle of the actual essay question or the task that you've been set. Often your lecturer will actually outline what that angle should be, which will obviously reduces the amount of material you might be looking at, but nonetheless you still have to actually go to a range of academic sources. So other people who've spent a lot of time studying these things, who've done their own research, who've come up with certain theories, certain views, etc., that you can use in your own material. And in this respect, your opinion becomes an informed opinion, and whilst, yes, your opinion gets subsumed by those other opinions, in essence, you still get to actually express your opinion, but you do it through the voices of other people, which doesn't mean that you become obsolete in a sense, but you certainly become a conduit for information. And the more subtle you become, or I guess maybe the more experience you become in writing academic work, the more subtly you can introduce your own opinions through or mediated via other people's voices. And this is something that's important. But the point is that you have to at least demonstrate the ability and the resourcefulness of going out to review a whole lot of literature that relate to a particular topic, and then use that literature to defend a position or to argue a position. Often this material is referred to as just the literature. What is the and so, for example, you'll hear, what does the literature say about this particular thing? Now, in this case, the literature would usually pertain to all the, I guess, for want of a better word, the figureheads, the main researchers, the main people who have worked in that particular area. And inevitably, in every topic area, there is several people who are prominent and well considered in that particular area, and they're the people that generally you begin with, and then move on to perhaps more obscure or ancillary readings pertaining to that particular topic. Now, academic literature comes in a whole variety of forms. Traditionally, it was always in books and journal articles. Now that's expanded to things like online journal articles, etc., blog sites, a range of other mediums in which you can actually obtain academic literature. The more traditional modes, particularly with books and hard copy journals, sadly have gone the way of most things, and I think symbolically libraries have literally reduced their book sections down to, I guess, a margin on the edge of a building, where the predominant mode of getting this material is actually via computers, which again for me is a fairly kind of sad eventuality, I guess. I like the fact that obviously less trees will be cut down to produce books, for instance, but I like the tactile nature of books. For me, my first degree was actually done solely through books, and I guess I have some nostalgic views of that process of actually going into a library and manually discovering books, so searching out the shelves, for instance. And it sounds, I guess, romantic in some senses. On the other hand, it could be quite frustrating when you couldn't get the book you wanted or it was already out on loan. However, like I said, I still have some sentiment, I guess, towards that particular way of finding information. In the case of UTAS, even though our book sections have got smaller, they are relevant in the sense that they've got contemporary books. It's kept up to date in that sense. They're relevant to most topics, and for me, even the smallish library at Cradle Coast has what I consider to be an excellent source of information on all the main subjects that are actually lectured in across the campus, and I was actually quite pleasantly surprised how much material there was. While talking about the literature, I have to say that the key thing with any of your research, I've already just talked about how you would actually search out material from a variety of sources in a topic before you can actually argue or defend a position. In the process of that, given that you're actually garnering other people's arguments, you have to acknowledge those arguments. So those sources of information you didn't have before you read that book or looked at that journal or literally read through that blog or whatever it might be in the form that it's in. And so you have to acknowledge the people who actually have done the work, who created or did the research or created the theories, etc. So as a process, you have to create some sort of form of acknowledgement. And today's lecture focuses on that fact, that if you're reading material from anywhere outside of your normal scope of knowledge, then if you're actually going to use that material to defend a position, you have to acknowledge the person who generated that argument, or in a wider sense, their work. Which leads me on to the notion of academic integrity. On slide 5, I very briefly talk about academic integrity being the process of honestly and truthfully submitting work that is your own, which clearly acknowledges the ideas, words, creations, images, etc. of others. The point being is that these things don't happen in a vacuum. Often, like I said, it's the labours of people for sometimes years to actually come up with and develop certain arguments or certain positions. You have to acknowledge the fact that those people have done that work. Without doing it, without actually acknowledging it, the immediate assumption is that it's your work. And given that it's not your work, you then have to tip your hat to the person who did do the work. Now, I'm not a huge fan of labouring the point around academic dishonesty, but on page 6 I give examples. For instance, plagiarism, which is copying other people's work and then putting it in as your own. Cheating, in other words, literally looking at other people's work and perhaps stealing ideas, for instance. Misrepresenting information. So, for instance, you take an argument and skew it in some way towards your own argument by the omission of certain facts in a particular document. Obviously, allowing someone else to even just copy your work is, in a sense, cheating. Not in a sense, it is. Um, and I mean, as a small aside, I mean, one of the points that I put in is selling academic or computer assignments. And I actually looked into this when I was living in England to find out how much these companies are paying for people to actually write assignments, because for the most part they are original. What you do as a student, you would submit an essay question, obviously with some form of payment, and then ask for a grading on that particular assignment. So you can actually request a particular grade. And with that, you would then have an original document that, of course, you haven't written, but you've paid someone else to write. Now, the intriguing thing is that the people writing the assignments were, from memory, getting something like £9 an hour, so roughly around $16, $17 an hour to write it. Now, I figured that for someone to write a page of well-written academic work in that time would be getting a very low hourly rate, which I thought was intriguing. And we did have an example of one chap who came onto our courses who paid, it looked like he paid, because we couldn't find any examples of where he might have copied it from the internet, where he paid for a report. So his major report for one of our units, I suspect he paid perhaps several £100s to have this report written, and we couldn't prove that he had it paid for. Naturally, whilst this may look good, because we had to give him a high distinction because we couldn't tell whether it was dishonestly obtained or not. For me, I guess the only solace that I had beyond my annoyance at him getting through was the fact that he would get caught out at some point. Short of being extremely wealthy and being able to pay for every assignment in every subject area, I think eventually he would be caught out. His work would either be marked down or perhaps even failed. In terms of UTAS, we have a blue poster of shame that is put up every year in the hallways of our campuses that actually indicate people who've been punished for cheating in various forms. And they're actually given suspensions or some sort of penalty. Usually it's the failure in a unit, so despite how much work they may have done, they fail a unit. And I had an example in England where a woman who got caught for time decided to literally cut and paste a whole lot of material off the internet, presented it as her own because she simply didn't have the time to do the assignments. Sadly, sadly for her that is, we checked through the work and she had been an excellent student, but we found other examples of cheating, particularly in the last 2 months of her work, and we ended up failing her completely on the course, which was quite upsetting for her, as you can imagine. Even more upsetting for us, because up to that point she'd been an excellent student. One of the key ways to avoid plagiarism is to keep good records. So whenever you read, a journal article, a chapter in a book, or even a book itself, you take the page numbers down, you take the author down, you take the actual publishing date, you take the publishing house, for instance, and obviously the author's name. You take all those things, you scribble them down in a margin if you're just copying out notes. And for me personally, when I was doing my honours year, I had 2 or 3 exercise books that were literally full of quotes and ideas and theories, etc., that came from perhaps 50 or 60 different sources. So my thesis was certainly that recording the information in a reference list at the end was quite easy, because I could just literally translate that from my notepad immediately into the reference list. And for the most part, I constructed the reference list before I even began the work. I kind of had a fair idea about what I would be using. I ended up culling quite a bit of it, but you still need those records. My own opinion about this was simply that better to swing wide, to throw your net fairly wide, get as many references as you can, because you don't know whether you'll need them or not. And yes, there is a large cull rate, as I've already said. However, usually in the process of writing, you're not exactly sure what you'll use. Things that seem quite obscure at the time of reading may come to the forefront when you're actually doing the writing. And being able to backtrack and find those references again, that's another key thing about keeping a notebook or a log on the internet, is that you find, and I used to jot down where I actually got my sources from, be it from the library, be it from the public library, be it online, for instance. So I always had some sort of trail that I could go back, because it's often the case that you'll read something perhaps 2-3 weeks, sometimes months earlier, and you need to reacquaint yourself with the broader picture of the argument that was presented. So I used to find myself, particularly if I was using a source as a central part of my argument, that I would go back and reread some of the work that I'd read, like I said, perhaps months earlier, just so I could actually have a broader context in which to, I guess, create the argument that I needed to make to answer a particular essay, or assignment task. Now, very briefly, I want to talk about terms that you'll come upon in your studies. Those are, and if you have a look on slide 9, you've got bibliography, reference lists, citation, referencing style. All of these obviously have different meanings, and I just want to briefly talk about what they are. Very briefly, a bibliography simply is a list of sources that a student's used in development of their work. It refers to all of the sources consulted, not necessarily the ones that were directly used or cited in the body of the work. Often you'll find, particularly in your honours year, for instance, and even in your third year, that there may be a whole range of books that you look at in your quest to answer a question. And during that process, you will, of course, read material that perhaps doesn't have a large relevance or bearing on the particular argument, but may still inform it. Now, you may not use that directly in your work, but you still need to have some, I guess, a list or some sort of acknowledgement that you actually had a look at that material. The one thing it does demonstrate, certainly to the person marking your work, is that you're actually willing to cast your net fairly wide in terms of the material that was available for this particular assignment task. And that being the case, it demonstrates that you've read widely, and that you've made a genuine attempt to understand the subject in a much broader way. And to me, this is a credit to a student, and would certainly gain, if not necessarily marks, but certainly a better perception of your work. In contrast, a reference list is actually the details. So when I say the details, I mean literally the things that you used in your actual writing. So it contains the full reference details of all sources directly used and cited in your work. So anything that you mention in your work, so an author, an idea, obviously, which will have an author appended to it in most cases, then you have to obviously put that through in a reference list. What you have to remember is that in terms of referencing, when you see a small in-text reference, it makes no sense, because it only has the surname of the author, it has the year date, and perhaps a page number. Now, that would be fine if we could actually trace that back to that author. But if we had, say, an author named, I don't know, Smith, and then we had 1972, and then we had page 26. Now, there may have been tens of thousands of Smiths writing in 1972, so it doesn't help us trace back to who we actually need to find out where you got this particular information from. And that's the key thing. That's one of the main reasons we reference, is that not only does it acknowledge the author and their work, and that should be, like I said, that's a credit to them, but also it helps the marker, if they need to, verify where you got your information from. And particularly in your case, with undergrad studies, for instance, or pre-degree in this case, that you can demonstrate that you have read this material, that you've represented it in the right way, and then for the marker's sake, they can look at the material, and generally they've read most of the stuff that you'll be looking at. They can then make a judgment about how you've used that material, how you've represented that author and their ideas. A citation refers to the form used within the body of a piece of writing to acknowledge an academic source. So generally what this means, and I'll put an example on slide 12, it has the author's name, it has the year date of the publication, and usually the page number. Depends on which system you're actually using, so which referencing system that is. And literally is simply a signpost for the work in the, or I should say the work of the author in the reference list. It's just an indicator, just a sign. I suppose I guess an adjoinder to that statement, doing citations, even though they're crucial, obviously, as signposts to the referencing list, there has to be a clear link. That's often a mistake people make. They don't put one or the other in, or don't put them in correctly. With citations, what you find is that over time and with experience, you'll get better at it. It's a little bit difficult, and most people get fairly nervous about actually using citations, etc., in work, and I've heard from students every semester that I've done this particular type of work that there's almost a reluctance or a resistance to use referencing because they're afraid they'll get it wrong. Me personally, I think I'd rather see something poorly done, but an attempt made, and have that corrected than not use it at all. Your work in an academic sense will appear a lot more coherent, a lot more cogent, in the sense that you will be trying to get other people's opinions, including them within your own, or as the boundary of your own opinions, and because you'll be supporting your arguments in such a way, you are already becoming an academic, which is I guess the purpose of this course, and obviously university as a whole, to follow an academic system of producing knowledge. And what you will find with different faculties is there's certain preferences for certain styles or a referencing style. Each faculty seems to have their own referencing style. For instance, with us and with the arts, generally it's the Harvard system. With psychology, for instance, you have the APA system. Education, it's APA, depending on which unit you do. And for me, the quicker you get your head round a particular style, the easier it is, because often marks are associated with the correct use of referencing, and you'll often see on rubrics, for instance, certain marks allocated for referencing. And referencing is one of those things that, as I said, you develop over time, you get better at it, more proficient, and it seems odd that as a beginner student, that you wouldn't spend a lot of time making perhaps quite a few mistakes doing referencing to get it right, to achieve marks that otherwise you do have to do nothing but simply get something correct, so put it in the correct order, etc. In this particular unit and across the whole team of units, we use the Harvard system. Now, to me, it's probably the most fluid and the easiest one to use. The conventions are fairly easy to follow, and personally, I would attempt to get that right in terms of using the Harvard system, get it right, and then build from there, because the other systems are simply adaptations of the Harvard system. Well, that's how I'd like to perceive it anyway. Moving on slide 15, I've actually said something about bibliographic details, recording sheets, students in this sense are advised to actually create some sort of system of recording their or recording the bibliographical details for particular books, and when they're out in search of resources. Me personally, I used to keep a running log. Whenever I actually wrote any sort of essay, what I did was construct the bibliographical list first. So in other words, I would have a working Word document. I often used the reference list and the recording of it as the starting point of the assignment. So if I was struggling to kick off an assignment, so had writer's block, I would do I'd create almost a performer, and I'd put in all the details for the books that I'd read as a starting point, just so the page wasn't blank. Now, you don't have to go through the formality of necessarily having bibliographical recording sheets. I mean, I'll leave that up to you. Personally, I think you have to have some mechanism of recording. This is as good as any. The reason I've included them in this lecture and as an activity is to actually get you into the practice of actually recording information, how you might record it, where you might record it, and what bits of it you have to record. And if you have a quick look on slide 16, I've given an example of two books that are both in the library here at UTAS and Cradle Coast and on the other campuses. For me, like I said, the detail is fairly great. I never used to include the call number. I never felt that I needed to. However, all the other details I used to, particularly page numbers of information. So if I had been reading a particular chapter, and found some interesting fact, or some something that was prominent in terms of my construction of an argument, for instance, I would always record the page number, because it's extremely difficult to go back to a book, even a week or even days later, if you've been reading other material, to go back and actually find the correct page number. And this was an immense frustration in my first year at university, where I realised that I had to actually formalise the way I recorded information, simply so I could go back to find it. At the time I was reading history, and there's a lot of material available in terms of history and the historical events around medieval times, for instance, in Europe. And to go back and try and find that material if I'd spent a week doing research was extremely difficult. So, inevitably, I came up with a system that was similar to this, although literally it was done in an exercise book. Obviously, depending on the source, you have to record different information, and I hope you take note of slide 19 and the information that you have to actually record for a website, for instance, or a website article. You have to do this, and like I said, if you're doing it manually, it can be extremely long, particularly if you've got a lot of authors involved. But like I said, I'll let you go through the examples and come up with ways that you think are best to record information, because like I said, you have to record these in some form, and they have to appear in reference lists or bibliographical lists at some point. Now, for distance students, what I'd like you to do, if you could, is actually print off the 3 bibliographical sheets and actually attempt to do some examples from home. That may be difficult in some respects, because you perhaps, you may not have, for instance, like a journal available. But anyway, have a look, see what you can find. Make some attempt, use an online journal if the case may be. I had hoped to use a range of different sources, because the more that you use, the more you'll be familiar with the process. And I guess ultimately my justification for this as a process is that you'll be using this throughout your degree and into your postgrad studies if you go that far. This will be a skill that you'll use literally from now onwards, and the sooner, like I said, you get better at it, the easier it will be to actually do it and put it into practice. But also the more marks you'll get, because as I say, there's often a marking component around referencing. I've put in some additional library resources. There's several links there. It would be worth maybe just having a look just to become familiar with them, because again they will appear in other units that you do as you go further into your undergrad studies. Attempt the exercise that I've put there if you can. Where do you draw the line? The other thing that I perhaps want to say before I complete this lecture is that the article that I've included, Is Google Making Us Stupid?, to me is perhaps one of the most profound things that I've considered, but also that I want you to consider also. Personally, and it was almost by coincidence, or synchronicity almost, that I found this article, because for 2 or 3 years I was beginning to question my own levels of concentration, my own ability to actually stay on task, for want of a better word, want of a better expression. So I began to question myself, why couldn't I concentrate? Why did I need to flit from thing to thing, or that I couldn't actually stay focused on things? And this line of, I guess, inquiry and self-reflection was not a comfortable prospect for me, because I had been used to having long stints with books, etc. During my years of study, and felt very comfortable in that kind of environment. And I guess, if nothing else, it was my belief that perhaps maybe age, I'm 48 now, age had maybe changed my concentration levels, or was there something else afoot? And I'd begun to kind of suspect that my use of the internet and as a medium of information had created this almost this butterfly-like mental activity where I would flit from one thing to the next. So any bit of information would then lead to other bits of information, none of which I would spend any great deal of time over reflecting or considering. And I came upon this article 2 years ago in England, and immediately it struck a chord with me. And I'd like you guys, if you can, to consider this, genuinely consider it, and if you can, concentrate long enough, and that's the intriguing paradox, to actually read the article and reflect on your own cognitions, your own brain, and how you work, how you operate, and how you focus. Anyway, I'll leave that tantalising prospect with you guys. Have a great week, and if you can, like I said, attempt to do the bibliography sheets if you could, bibliographic sheets, sorry. Do them, and perhaps, like I said, consider the way you concentrate on your work. It could be interesting. Anyway, see you later.